Born in 1694 in Paris, Voltaire lived 83 years that spanned the twilight of absolute monarchy and the dawn of revolutionary thought. Voltaire was not a systematic philosopher. He built no grand metaphysical systems. Instead, he weaponized clarity, wit, and empirical thinking against the intellectual scaffolding of his age. He wrote more than 20,000 letters and 2,000 books. His output touched every literary form, from plays to histories to scientific expositions. Yet his genius lay not in creating new philosophical systems, but in demolishing bad ones. Understanding Voltaire requires grasping a central paradox. He championed reason, yet mocked philosophers who claimed absolute knowledge. He defended religious belief, yet spent his life attacking religious institutions. He advocated freedom, yet supported enlightened despotism. These apparent contradictions dissolve when you understand his fundamental commitment. Voltaire believed humans could improve their condition through critical thinking, empirical observation, and persistent questioning of authority. But he recognized that human reason had strict limits. His influence extends far beyond his era. The American founders absorbed his ideas about freedom of speech and religious tolerance. The French Revolution invoked his attacks on superstition and privilege. Modern secularism owes its foundation to his relentless separation of church and state. Yet Voltaire remains widely misunderstood. He never wrote the famous quote often attributed to him about defending another's right to speak. He was not an atheist, though his enemies called him one. He did not believe in pure democracy, though he fought for individual liberty. This exploration will excavate the actual structure of Voltaire's thinking. We will examine his epistemology, his method of critique, his religious philosophy, and his political views. We will trace how his ideas evolved through encounters with English empiricism, Newtonian science, and devastating events like the Lisbon earthquake. We will see how his satire functioned as philosophical argument, and we will confront the limitations and contradictions that scholars still debate. Part 1. The architecture of Voltaire's philosophical method. Voltaire's philosophical approach emerged from a profound encounter with English thought during his exile from 1726 to 1729. In England, he discovered a radically different intellectual climate. John Locke had argued that human knowledge derives entirely from sensory experience, not from innate ideas. Isaac Newton had demonstrated that mathematical description of observable phenomena could reveal nature's laws without requiring metaphysical speculation about underlying essences. These insights revolutionized Voltaire's thinking. Locke's epistemology provided Voltaire with a powerful weapon against rationalist philosophers like Descartes, Leibniz, and Malebranche. These thinkers believed reason alone could discover fundamental truths about reality through deduction from self-evident principles. Locke demonstrated this approach rested on shaky foundations. If all knowledge comes from sense experience, then anything beyond possible observation remains unknowable. This means metaphysical systems claiming to explain the ultimate nature of reality exceed human cognitive capacity. Voltaire seized this insight and transformed it into an offensive strategy. His Letters Concerning the English Nation, published in 1733, contrasted Newton's empirical method with Cartesian speculation. Descartes had proposed that matter moves through direct contact with invisible particles in swirling vortices of ether. This mechanistic explanation seemed comprehensive and rationally satisfying. But it required accepting the existence of things no one could observe or measure. Newton rejected such speculation. He described gravitational attraction mathematically without claiming to know what gravity actually is or how it works. This Newtonian approach contained radical implications. It meant that good science describes regular patterns in observable phenomena. It does not explain why those patterns exist or what ultimate reality looks like beneath appearances. Voltaire extended this principle beyond natural science to all human knowledge. Questions that cannot be answered through observation and reason should be set aside. Metaphysical speculation about the soul, the ultimate nature of matter, or divine purposes wastes intellectual energy. Consider how this method transformed philosophical debate. Traditional philosophy asked whether the soul is material or immaterial. Descartes argued the soul must be immaterial substance because thinking cannot arise from matter. Voltaire responded that this argument presumes to know what matter can and cannot do. What if God gave matter the capacity to think? We cannot observe consciousness arising, so we cannot definitively answer this question. The debate becomes fruitless. What matters practically is that humans can think, feel, and make moral choices. Whether the substrate is material or immaterial changes nothing about how we should live. This pragmatic empiricism shaped Voltaire's entire intellectual program. He dismissed abstract debates about the nature of God's perfection. He rejected rational proofs of immortality. He mocked philosophers who claimed to deduce the structure of reality from pure reason. Instead, he focused on questions with practical consequences. How should societies organize themselves? What degree of freedom benefits human welfare? How can superstition and fanaticism be reduced? Voltaire's empiricism connected directly to his advocacy for tolerance. If human reason cannot access absolute truth about metaphysics or theology, then no sect can claim certain knowledge that justifies persecuting others. Different religious groups hold incompatible beliefs about God, salvation, and the afterlife. These beliefs cannot be verified through sense experience or rational demonstration. Therefore, forcing people to accept particular religious doctrines becomes both futile and tyrannical. Tolerance emerges not from relativism, but from intellectual humility about reason's limits. The practical application appears in Voltaire's Treatise on Tolerance from 1763. He wrote this work to defend Jean Calas, a Protestant falsely accused of murdering his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Calas was tortured and executed based on religious prejudice rather than evidence. Voltaire argued that this tragedy resulted from metaphysical certainty breeding fanaticism. When people believe they possess absolute truth, they feel justified using violence against those who disagree. Acknowledging the limits of human knowledge dissolves this justification. Voltaire's critique of metaphysics extended to philosophical optimism, the doctrine that this is the best of all possible worlds. Gottfried Leibniz had argued that an all-good and all-powerful God must have chosen to create the best possible universe. Any evil or suffering must serve a greater good we cannot fully comprehend. This metaphysical system attempted to reconcile divine benevolence with observable suffering. It provided rational justification for accepting even horrific events as somehow necessary. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 killed between 30,000 and 60,000 people. Churches collapsed during Mass on All Saints' Day. Fire and tsunami followed the initial shock. Voltaire found Leibnizian optimism obscene when confronted with such destruction. To claim these deaths served a higher purpose, that this remained the best possible world, insulted victims and encouraged passive acceptance of evil. His satirical novel Candide from 1759 demolished philosophical optimism through relentless accumulation of horrors. The protagonist endures war, torture, shipwreck, earthquake and betrayal. His tutor Pangloss mechanically repeats that everything happens for the best, regardless of evidence. Voltaire shows how metaphysical systems can become tools for avoiding reality rather than understanding it. Pangloss refuses to help earthquake victims because he is busy explaining why the disaster was metaphysically necessary. The novel ends with Candide rejecting grand philosophical explanations. He concludes that we must cultivate our garden. This famous phrase has generated centuries of scholarly debate. Does it advocate retreat from public life into private cultivation? Does it suggest practical work over abstract theorizing? Does it propose improving the self rather than reforming society? The ambiguity seems intentional. Voltaire offers no new metaphysical system to replace Leibnizian optimism. Instead, he redirects attention from cosmic speculation to immediate, tangible human action. Voltaire's empiricism drew from cognitive limitations humans actually face. Our sensory apparatus constrains what we can know. We perceive a tiny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. We observe the world from one spatio-temporal location. Our reasoning capacity, though impressive, frequently produces errors. These are not failures requiring correction, but fundamental features of human cognition. Acknowledging them generates intellectual humility rather than skeptical paralysis. This humility did not make Voltaire a relativist or skeptic about all knowledge. He believed science could discover reliable truths about natural phenomena. He believed moral reasoning could identify better and worse ways to organize society. He believed history could teach lessons about human behavior. But these beliefs operated within strict boundaries. Scientific knowledge describes patterns, not ultimate essences. Moral reasoning generates pragmatic guidelines, not absolute commandments. Historical lessons emerge from empirical study, not from preconceived philosophical systems. The connection to modern cognitive science deserves attention. Contemporary neuroscience reveals that human reasoning involves systematic biases and heuristics. We seek confirming evidence for beliefs we already hold. We construct narratives that impose coherence on ambiguous data. We privilege vivid, recent information over abstract statistical patterns. These cognitive features would not have surprised Voltaire. His skepticism about metaphysical systems anticipated recognition that human minds construct comforting stories rather than perceiving reality directly. Voltaire's method also connects to his literary strategy. He rarely wrote systematic philosophical treatises. Instead, he deployed satire, dialogue, fictional narrative, and polemical essay. This choice was not merely stylistic. Complex metaphysical arguments require readers who possess specialized training and leisure for careful study. Voltaire wanted to reach broader audiences and bypass official gatekeepers of knowledge. Satire could penetrate where argument could not. Humor disarmed defenses and made dangerous ideas palatable. Narrative engaged emotions alongside intellect. Consider how Candide functions philosophically. Rather than presenting logical objections to Leibnizian optimism, Voltaire juxtaposes the doctrine with vivid descriptions of suffering. Readers feel the absurdity before they think it. This emotional impact then motivates rational reflection about why the doctrine fails. The novel demonstrates that philosophical argument need not take the form of academic treatise. Literature can embody philosophical insight just as effectively. This approach generated criticism then and now. Academic philosophers accused Voltaire of lacking rigor. He failed to engage opponents' strongest arguments. He used strawman caricatures rather than serious intellectual engagement. His satirical method encouraged mockery over careful reasoning. These criticisms contain truth. Voltaire did simplify complex positions for rhetorical effect. His representation of Leibniz through the character Pangloss stripped away nuance and sophistication. But this critique misses Voltaire's purpose. He was not writing for other philosophers. He aimed to undermine the social authority that metaphysical systems enjoyed. These systems supported institutions from the Catholic Church to absolutist monarchies that exercised enormous power over ordinary people. Voltaire believed intellectual warfare required varied weapons. Precise logical refutation served one purpose. Biting satire that destroyed credibility served another. Both had legitimate roles in advancing human understanding. The deeper issue involves the relationship between philosophy and social change. Can careful academic argument shift popular opinion and transform institutions? Or does fundamental change require engaging emotions, challenging status, and making powerful interests appear ridiculous? Voltaire chose the latter path. His literary brilliance made dangerous ideas entertaining. His wit disarmed censors and reached audiences systematic philosophy could never touch. The method succeeded. His work circulated throughout Europe despite official bans. His ideas shaped revolutionary movements that transformed Western civilization. Part 2. Religious Philosophy, Deism, God, and the Critique of Christianity. Voltaire's religious views remain among the most misunderstood aspects of his philosophy. His enemies called him an atheist. His supporters claimed him as a champion of pure reason. The historical record reveals something more complex and intellectually interesting. Voltaire was a deist who believed in God but rejected virtually everything organized religions taught about that God. Deism emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries as a middle path between traditional Christianity and atheism. Deists accepted that God exists and created the universe. They rejected revelation, miracles, prophets, and supernatural intervention in natural affairs. God established natural laws that govern the cosmos, then allowed those laws to operate without interference. Human reason and observation, not scripture or church authority, provide the only reliable path to knowledge about God. Voltaire arrived at deism through multiple routes. First came the design argument, which he found intellectually compelling throughout his life. When observing the intricate organization of nature, from planetary motion to biological structures, he concluded an intelligent designer must exist. The universe exhibits mathematical regularities and functional complexity that seem to require purposeful creation. Matter randomly combining could not produce such ordered phenomena. Therefore, a supreme intelligence must have designed and created the natural world. This reasoning paralleled Newton's approach to natural philosophy. Newton had demonstrated that gravitational force operates according to precise mathematical laws throughout the universe. This universal order suggested a divine lawgiver who established those principles. Voltaire extended this logic. Just as gravitational law applies equally everywhere, moral law must derive from universal divine reason rather than culturally specific religious traditions. The Golden Rule appears across civilizations because it reflects natural moral law, not because any particular prophet revealed it. The second route to Voltaire's deism involved psychological and sociological analysis. He observed that belief in God serves crucial social functions. Without divine reward and punishment, Voltaire feared many people would lack motivation to behave morally. His famous statement captures this view. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. This phrase often gets misinterpreted as cynical atheism masquerading as belief. Actually, it expressed genuine conviction that social order requires belief in a just God who judges human actions. This utilitarian justification for theism generated significant criticism. If you believe in God primarily for social utility rather than because evidence compels that belief, do you actually believe? Voltaire would respond that the design argument provides rational evidence, while social utility provides additional practical reasons. Both considerations point toward the same conclusion. The universe exhibits design requiring a designer. Society functions better when people believe in divine justice. These independent lines of reasoning converge on theistic belief. However, Voltaire's God differed radically from the Christian God. The deist God creates the universe and establishes natural and moral laws, then withdraws. This God does not answer prayers or perform miracles. This God does not reveal himself through prophets or inspired texts. This God does not have a chosen people or a preferred religious denomination. Most importantly, this God cannot be known through anything except reason and observation of nature. Claims about God's will or purposes that go beyond what reason establishes are human inventions. Voltaire attacked revealed religion with unprecedented ferocity. Christianity claimed that God revealed himself uniquely through Jesus Christ. The Bible supposedly contained God's direct communication to humanity. Church councils and papal authority determined correct interpretation of divine revelation. Voltaire systematically demolished each of these claims. He pointed out contradictions within biblical texts. He highlighted how church doctrines changed over time based on political considerations rather than divine guidance. He showed how different Christian sects interpreted the same revelation in mutually incompatible ways. His Philosophical Dictionary, published in 1764, contained devastating entries on religious topics. Under religion, he argued that true religion must be universal, accessible to all humans through reason alone. Particular religions with specific rituals and dogmas reflect human cultural invention, not divine command. Under miracles, he demonstrated that miracle claims violate natural law without sufficient evidence to overcome that violation's implausibility. Under atheism, he attacked atheistic materialism while also criticizing religious superstition, positioning his deism as the rational middle ground. The historical Jesus received sympathetic treatment from Voltaire compared to institutional Christianity. Jesus taught moral principles consistent with natural law. Love your neighbor, forgive injuries, help the poor. These teachings required no supernatural revelation, since reason could discover them independently. But Christianity transformed this simple moral teaching into elaborate metaphysical doctrines about incarnation, atonement, Trinity, and salvation. These additions reflected theological speculation and political manipulation rather than anything Jesus actually taught or intended. Voltaire reserved special contempt for religious intolerance and persecution. Throughout European history, Christians had tortured and killed those who disagreed about theological minutiae. The Inquisition burned heretics. Protestant and Catholic armies slaughtered each other over transubstantiation. Jews faced expulsion and forced conversion. All this violence stemmed from the claim that one group possessed absolute truth revealed by God. If people recognized that humans cannot know God's nature or will with certainty, religious violence would become impossible to justify. The Calas affair illustrated this point vividly. Jean Calas was a Protestant merchant in Toulouse whose son committed suicide. Catholic authorities accused Calas of murdering his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Despite no evidence beyond religious prejudice, Calas was tortured on the wheel and executed in 1762. Voltaire investigated the case, published pamphlets exposing the injustice, and campaigned for posthumous exoneration. He succeeded in 1765 when the verdict was overturned. This case demonstrated how religious certainty breeds fanaticism that destroys innocent lives. Voltaire's critique of superstition extended beyond Christianity to all organized religions. He defined superstition as belief in supernatural causation of natural events. When people attribute disease to demonic possession rather than physical causes, they practice superstition. When they believe ritual actions manipulate divine favor, they practice superstition. When they think sacred objects possess magical power, they practice superstition. All religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, incorporated such superstitious elements. These elements reflected ignorance and fear rather than rational understanding of how nature operates. The relationship between superstition and social control concerned Voltaire deeply. Priests claimed special access to supernatural powers and divine knowledge. This claim generated enormous social authority and material wealth for religious institutions. The Catholic Church owned vast land holdings throughout Europe. It collected tithes from peasants who could barely survive. It exercised political influence over monarchs and governments. All this power rested on superstitious beliefs that Voltaire considered demonstrably false. By attacking superstition, he attacked the foundation of clerical authority. His battle cry, "Écrasez l'infâme," meaning "crush the infamous thing," became famous. The infamous thing referred to institutional Christianity's combination of superstition, fanaticism, and tyranny. Voltaire did not call for eliminating religious belief entirely. Rather, he wanted to destroy the institutions that exploited superstition to maintain power and persecute dissenters. Replace corrupt institutional religion with simple deism, and you preserve social order while eliminating religious violence. This program faced an obvious problem. If sophisticated intellectuals could embrace rational deism, what about common people lacking education and leisure for philosophical reflection? Voltaire doubted the masses could grasp abstract deistic principles. He sometimes suggested that simple faith in a God who punishes wrongdoing and rewards virtue served the social function deism served for intellectuals. The content mattered less than the functional outcome. Moral behavior supported by belief in divine justice. This elitist dimension in Voltaire's thought troubles many modern readers. He seemed to advocate sophisticated philosophy for the educated classes while supporting simplified religion to control the masses. The contradiction appears sharp. Voltaire championed human reason and criticized those who kept people ignorant through superstition. Yet he doubted ordinary people could handle philosophical truth without social discipline provided by religious belief. He wanted to destroy priestly power while preserving belief systems that maintained social order. Recent scholarship has challenged the traditional view that Voltaire remained a consistent deist throughout his life. Analysis of his later writings suggests movement towards something resembling Spinozistic pantheism. Baruch Spinoza had argued that God and nature are identical, that everything exists necessarily within the divine substance. Voltaire initially rejected this position as disguised atheism, but his later works show increasing sympathy for the idea that matter might be eternal and that God might be identical with the natural order rather than a separate creator. This evolution makes sense given Voltaire's empiricism. The design argument faces a logical problem. If complex order requires an intelligent designer, what accounts for the designer's complex intelligence? Either that intelligence arose without a designer, which undermines the original argument, or an infinite regress of designers exists, which is absurd. One solution involves treating the universe itself as necessarily existing and self-organizing rather than requiring external creation. This approach leads toward Spinozistic monism, where God equals nature. However, Voltaire never fully embraced Spinozism or abandoned his deistic commitments. He continued arguing for design and criticizing atheistic materialism even in his final years. His views probably remained somewhat unstable and context-dependent. In public writings aimed at broad audiences, he defended deism against atheism. In private correspondence with fellow philosophes, he expressed more radical doubts about traditional theism. This duality reflected both political caution and genuine intellectual uncertainty about profound questions. The cognitive science of religious belief offers useful perspective on Voltaire's position. Contemporary research shows that humans possess cognitive mechanisms predisposing us toward religious belief. We naturally detect agency and intention in ambiguous phenomena. We intuitively think in terms of purpose and design rather than blind mechanism. We find moral rules more compelling when attributed to divine command rather than human convention. These cognitive tendencies are not cultural accidents, but evolutionary adaptations. They helped our ancestors survive by promoting social cohesion and moral behavior. From this perspective, Voltaire's argument that society needs religious belief gains empirical support. Humans are not blank slates who can easily abandon intuitive religious cognition for abstract philosophical deism. The question becomes whether refined deism, or traditional religion, better channels natural religious impulses. Voltaire argued that purified deism preserves what's valuable, belief in divine justice, while eliminating what's harmful, sectarian violence and priestly tyranny. Whether this solution could work sociologically remained unclear. The French Revolution provided a brutal test case. Revolutionary leaders, influenced by Voltaire and other philosophes, attempted to de-Christianize France. They closed churches, persecuted clergy, and promoted a cult of reason based on Enlightenment principles. This project largely failed. Popular resistance forced eventual accommodation with Catholic tradition. Napoleon restored official Catholicism while maintaining secular state authority. The lesson seemed to be that you cannot simply replace traditional religion with rational deism through political decree. Voltaire's religious philosophy illuminates a permanent tension in modern secular societies. How much religious expression should liberal states permit in public life? Should government remain strictly neutral between religions or actively promote secular values? Can pluralistic societies function when citizens hold incompatible religious and philosophical views? These questions remain urgently relevant. Voltaire's answers, tolerance based on epistemological humility about metaphysical claims, still provide valuable guidance. We may not know ultimate religious truth, but we can agree that no one else knows it with certainty either. Part 3. Political Philosophy. Power, Liberty, and Enlightened Despotism. Voltaire's political philosophy contains apparent contradictions that have puzzled scholars for centuries. He championed individual liberty, yet supported absolute monarchy. He attacked tyranny, yet cultivated friendships with kings. He inspired democratic revolutionaries, yet distrusted democracy. These tensions dissolve when you understand his pragmatic approach to political questions and his historical context. Voltaire lived under French absolute monarchy where kings claimed to rule by divine right. Louis XIV, who died when Voltaire was 21, had declared, "I am the state." No constitution limited royal power. No parliament could block royal decrees. The monarch controlled military, judiciary, and religious institutions. Censorship, arbitrary imprisonment, and torture were routine instruments of state power. Voltaire personally experienced this system's brutality through his imprisonments in the Bastille. His exile in England from 1726 to 1729 revealed an alternative model. England had a constitutional monarchy where Parliament constrained royal power. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had established that monarchs ruled with parliamentary consent, not by divine right. England had relatively greater freedom of press and religion compared to France. Voltaire's Letters Concerning the English Nation praised this system as superior to French absolutism. English liberty, protected by law and institutional checks on power, allowed commerce and culture to flourish. However, Voltaire did not become a Democrat or Republican. He explicitly rejected the idea that political power should rest with common people. Democracy, in his view, meant mob rule, where ignorant masses make decisions beyond their understanding. The common people lacked education, sophistication, and leisure to govern wisely. They were easily manipulated by demagogues and swayed by passion rather than reason. Giving them political power would produce chaos and poor policy. Ancient republics offered no better model. Rome had been a republic for centuries, yet Roman history featured civil wars, proscriptions, and eventually collapse into empire. Greek city-states fought endless wars with each other. Both systems relied on slavery to sustain their political arrangements. Voltaire saw nothing admirable in ancient republicanism that warranted revival. These regimes proved just as tyrannical as monarchies, merely distributing power among aristocratic factions rather than concentrating it in one person. What Voltaire supported was enlightened despotism, rule by a philosophically educated absolute monarch who governed rationally in subjects' interests. The ideal enlightened despot would use his power to reform irrational institutions, reduce superstition, promote commerce and arts, establish fair legal codes, and protect individual liberty within appropriate bounds. Such a ruler could implement beneficial changes quickly, without obstruction from entrenched interests or ignorant popular opinion. Reform through enlightened monarchy seemed more practical than democratic or republican alternatives. Voltaire cultivated relationships with several rulers he considered enlightened despots. His correspondence with Frederick the Great of Prussia began in 1736, when Frederick was still Crown Prince. They exchanged hundreds of letters discussing philosophy, literature, and governance. Voltaire praised Frederick as a philosopher king who would govern according to reason rather than tradition or superstition. In 1750, he accepted Frederick's invitation to live at the Prussian court in Potsdam. The arrangement ended badly 3 years later. Frederick proved less enlightened in practice than in theory. He engaged Prussia in the 7 Years' War, which Voltaire considered unjustified carnage. He censored ideas that threatened his authority despite claiming to support free thought. He manipulated and eventually discarded Voltaire when their relationship became politically inconvenient. The personal betrayal combined with disillusionment about enlightened despotism's reality versus its ideal. Voltaire learned that even philosophically educated monarchs prioritize power over principle. Catherine the Great of Russia provided another test case. She corresponded with Voltaire and portrayed herself as an enlightened monarch implementing rational reforms. Voltaire praised her effusively in published writings. But Catherine's enlightenment had strict limits. She maintained serfdom, which amounted to slavery for millions of Russian peasants. She crushed popular uprisings brutally. She expanded imperial territory through aggressive wars. Her enlightenment extended only to cultural patronage and legal codification, not to fundamental reform of Russian society's oppressive structures. These experiences should have discredited enlightened despotism as a viable political program. If actual monarchs, even those sympathetic to Enlightenment ideas, failed to govern according to reason and justice, why expect better from others? Yet Voltaire never fully abandoned the concept. He seems to have viewed enlightened despotism as the best available option given political realities, even while recognizing its practical limitations. Gradual reform through rational monarchs seemed more plausible than revolution or democratic transformation. Voltaire's political philosophy emphasized property rights and commercial freedom. He believed secure property ownership and free trade generated prosperity that benefited society broadly. England's commercial success resulted from legal protections for property and merchants' freedom to engage in profitable exchanges. France's relative economic stagnation stemmed from arbitrary taxation, guild restrictions, internal tariffs, and privileges that distorted markets. Reform meant establishing rule of law that protected property and commerce from both government expropriation and private plunder. This economic liberalism connected to his views on social class. Voltaire considered the rising commercial bourgeoisie more valuable to society than the parasitic aristocracy. Nobles contributed nothing productive, merely consuming wealth extracted through inherited privilege. Merchants and manufacturers created value through enterprise and innovation. A rational society would honor productive achievement over hereditary status. Yet Voltaire himself bought a patent of nobility and displayed aristocratic pretensions throughout his life. His social criticism coexisted with personal investment in the status hierarchies he intellectually rejected. On legal reform, Voltaire took strong progressive positions. He attacked torture, which remained standard practice in French criminal procedure. Accused criminals were subjected to judicial torture to extract confessions. This barbaric system produced false confessions and condemned innocent people. Voltaire argued that torture was both cruel and epistemically unreliable. Pain makes people confess to anything to stop suffering, regardless of guilt or innocence. Rational criminal justice required abolishing torture and requiring evidence beyond confession. He also criticized capital punishment, though less consistently than his opposition to torture. Executing criminals seemed disproportionate except for the most serious offences. Many European legal codes mandated death for property crimes like theft. Voltaire argued this excessive severity actually undermined deterrence. When punishment is too severe relative to the crime, juries become reluctant to convict. Better to have proportionate punishment reliably applied than harsh punishment inconsistently enforced. This utilitarian reasoning about optimal punishment influenced later criminal law reform movements. The tension in Voltaire's political thought between liberty and authority requires careful analysis. He valued individual freedom, particularly freedom of thought, expression, and religion. Yet he supported political systems that concentrated enormous power in single rulers. These positions appear contradictory until you recognize the distinction between civil liberty and political power. Civil liberty means freedom from arbitrary interference in personal life, religion, expression, and economic activity. Political power means participation in government decisions and legislation. Voltaire believed enlightened despotism could protect civil liberty better than democracy or traditional monarchy. Democratic systems might allow majorities to tyrannize minorities. Traditional monarchies justified tyranny through divine right and religious authority. Enlightened despotism, in principle, separated civil and political domains. The monarch exercises political power but grants subjects extensive civil liberty. People enjoy freedom of thought and commerce without participating in governance. This arrangement protects what matters most while avoiding the dangers of popular rule. Of course, this model contains fatal flaws that Voltaire's experience with Frederick and Catherine should have clarified. Why would absolute monarchs voluntarily limit their power and protect subjects' liberty? What prevents enlightened despots from becoming ordinary despots when their interests conflict with their subjects' welfare? No institutional mechanisms constrain rulers who recognize no authority above themselves. The entire system depends on the rare coincidence of philosophical wisdom and political power in one person. This coincidence proves vanishingly unlikely in practice. Montesquieu, Voltaire's contemporary and fellow philosophe, offered a more sophisticated solution. In The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, Montesquieu argued for separation of powers among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. This institutional structure creates checks and balances that prevent concentration of power while maintaining effective government. The American founders studied Montesquieu closely and incorporated his ideas into the Constitution. Voltaire read The Spirit of the Laws, but never fully embraced its central insights about institutional design. Why did Voltaire remain attached to enlightened despotism despite its evident problems? Several factors likely contributed. First, his historical pessimism about human nature made him doubt common people's capacity for self-government. Second, his personal experience of court life and relationships with monarchs shaped his perception of political possibilities. Third, his focus on cultural and intellectual reform rather than institutional change led him to overestimate education's power to constrain authority. Fourth, his age and temperament inclined him toward gradual reform rather than revolutionary transformation. The French Revolution exposed the tensions in Voltaire's political legacy. Revolutionaries invoked Voltaire's name while destroying the monarchical system he had supported. They promoted democratic participation he had feared. They attacked the Catholic Church with violence exceeding even Voltaire's anti-clerical rhetoric. When the revolution descended into terror during 1793 and 94, some blamed Enlightenment philosophy for unleashing irrational violence. If Voltaire had taught people to question all authority and tradition, perhaps the terror resulted from his teachings. This interpretation misreads Voltaire's actual views. He never advocated overthrowing government through violence. He explicitly rejected popular revolution as likely to produce worse tyranny than it destroyed. He valued order and stability, not radical transformation. Revolutionary terror stemmed from factors beyond Enlightenment philosophy, including economic crisis, foreign invasion, and political radicalization under extreme circumstances. But the perception that Voltaire's ideas led to revolution and violence affected his posthumous reputation. Modern political theory offers frameworks for understanding Voltaire's position between liberalism and authoritarianism. Classical liberalism prioritizes individual liberty and limited government. Voltaire embraced the first principle while rejecting the second. He wanted maximal civil liberty within an authoritarian political structure. This combination reflects a political economy problem rather than mere inconsistency. How do you reform deeply entrenched institutions when those institutions control mechanisms of change? Voltaire saw enlightened monarchy as the most practical reform agent given existing power structures. Contemporary political science studies conditions under which authoritarian regimes implement liberal reforms. Some authoritarian rulers pursue economic liberalization, legal rationalization, and civil rights expansion to promote development and legitimacy. Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew, provides a frequently cited example. Such cases validate the possibility of Voltaire's model, liberal reforms implemented through authoritarian power. However, these cases also demonstrate the model's limitations. Without institutional constraints, authoritarian liberalism remains vulnerable to reversal when leadership changes or when liberal policies threaten rulers' interests. Voltaire's political philosophy ultimately reveals the difficulty of achieving liberty without democracy. Civil liberty requires protection from arbitrary power. But who protects that protection when no institutional checks constrain rulers? Only political participation, the ability to replace bad rulers and influence policy, provides reliable safeguards for civil liberty. Voltaire's faith in enlightened despotism reflected his era's limited experience with stable democracy. The successful democratic experiments in America and later in Europe showed that democratic participation and civil liberty can coexist. Voltaire helped create intellectual foundations for this achievement, even while misunderstanding the institutional requirements. Part 4. Tolerance and Freedom, the Foundation of Civil Society. Tolerance stands as Voltaire's most enduring contribution to political philosophy. His arguments for religious tolerance shaped modern conceptions of pluralism, civil liberty, and the secular state. These arguments emerged from both philosophical principles and urgent practical concerns. Understanding Voltaire's case for tolerance requires examining its epistemological foundations, its applications to specific injustices, and its limitations. The epistemological argument for tolerance flows directly from empiricist skepticism about metaphysical knowledge. If human reason cannot definitively establish truths about God's nature, the afterlife, or ultimate reality, then no religious group can claim certainty about these matters. All theological doctrines involve speculation beyond what observation and reasoning can verify. When one sect claims absolute truth and persecutes others for disagreeing, it asserts knowledge it cannot possibly possess. Intellectual humility about reason's limits demands tolerance for competing views on questions that exceed human cognitive capacity. Voltaire articulated this argument most clearly in A Treatise on Tolerance from 1763. He wrote this work to defend Jean Calas, the Protestant merchant wrongly executed for allegedly murdering his son. Voltaire investigated the case and determined that religious prejudice, not evidence, had produced the conviction. His treatise used the Calas affair to illustrate how religious intolerance destroys innocent lives. The same epistemological uncertainty that forbids metaphysical dogmatism also forbids religious persecution. The treatise begins with factual investigation of the Calas case. Voltaire details the evidence, showing conclusively that Marc-Antoine Calas committed suicide rather than being murdered by his father. Local Catholic authorities constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid this conclusion. They claim Protestant theology required Jean Calas to murder any family member contemplating Catholic conversion. This claim had no basis in Protestant doctrine or practice, but religious prejudice made the impossible seem plausible to Catholic judges and mobs. From this specific injustice, Voltaire extrapolates to general principles. Religious persecution always involves similar reasoning failures. One group assumes its theological views are certainly true and others certainly false. This assumption justifies using force to protect truth and punish error. But the assumption itself rests on fallacious reasoning. You cannot know your theological views are true with greater certainty than competing views held by equally intelligent, educated, sincere believers. Therefore, you cannot justify forcing others to accept your views through violence or legal compulsion. Voltaire reinforced this epistemological argument with historical examples. He surveyed religious tolerance in ancient civilizations including Rome, China, and Persia. These societies allowed multiple religions to coexist with minimal conflict. Roman polytheism particularly fascinated Voltaire. Romans permitted conquered peoples to maintain their traditional gods alongside Roman deities. This pragmatic tolerance avoided religious wars that plagued Christian Europe for centuries. The historical record showed that religious diversity need not produce violence when authorities accept pluralism. Christianity's historical record on tolerance was abysmal by comparison. Christians had persecuted Jews for supposed deicide. Catholics and Protestants had slaughtered each other during religious wars. The Inquisition had tortured and burned heretics for doctrinal deviations. Witch hunts had killed thousands of innocent people, mostly women. All this violence occurred in Christianity's name, justified by claims about protecting religious truth. Voltaire catalogued these atrocities to demonstrate that Christian civilization, despite its self-proclaimed moral superiority, produced more religious violence than pagan societies it considered barbaric. The practical argument for tolerance emphasized social utility. Religious persecution creates civil disorder, economic damage, and human suffering without achieving its stated goal of religious uniformity. Persecuted minorities either flee, taking their economic productivity elsewhere, or resist violently, triggering civil wars. Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 exemplified this disaster. The edict had granted French Protestants limited tolerance. Its revocation triggered mass Protestant emigration to England, Holland and Prussia. France lost skilled artisans, merchants and professionals, while strengthening rival nations. England provided a contrasting model. Despite religious tensions between Anglicans, Catholics and Protestant dissenters, England achieved greater tolerance than France. This tolerance correlated with England's commercial success and political stability. Different religious communities contributed to national prosperity rather than consuming resources through persecution. Voltaire argued that self-interest alone, independent of moral principle, should convince rulers to practice tolerance. Tolerant societies outcompete intolerant ones economically and politically. Beyond religious tolerance, Voltaire championed freedom of expression more broadly. He defended the right to criticize government, church, and received opinion. This position repeatedly placed him in danger. His philosophical letters were condemned and burned by French authorities. He spent much of his life in exile or strategic retreat to avoid imprisonment. Yet he continued publishing controversial works that attacked established institutions and ideas. The famous quotation attributed to Voltaire captures his position on free expression. "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Voltaire never actually wrote these words. They were composed by Evelyn Beatrice Hall in 1906 as a summary of his views. Nevertheless, the sentiment accurately reflects his commitment to free speech. Even expressions you find wrong or offensive deserve protection, because silencing them establishes dangerous precedent. However, Voltaire's commitment to free expression had limits that reveal tensions in his thought. He supported legal restrictions on speech that directly incited violence or undermined public order. He believed government could legitimately punish libel that destroyed individual reputations through false accusations. More problematically, he sometimes used his influence to silence critics and persecute intellectual opponents. His campaigns against rival writers occasionally employed the same tactics of censorship and social exclusion he opposed when used against himself. This inconsistency illuminates broader questions about tolerance's boundaries. Does tolerance require tolerating intolerance? If a group advocates persecution of others, must a tolerant society permit that advocacy? Voltaire never developed a systematic answer to these questions. His practical judgments varied by context. He defended controversial religious and philosophical views against state censorship. But he supported state action against what he considered dangerous fanaticism or seditious speech. Modern philosophers have grappled with these paradoxes of tolerance. Karl Popper argued in the 20th century that unlimited tolerance eventually destroys itself. Tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. But this response raises difficult questions about where to draw lines. What counts as dangerous intolerance requiring suppression versus merely offensive speech deserving protection? Who decides where these boundaries lie? Voltaire's own contradictions anticipate these ongoing debates about tolerance's scope and limits. The relationship between tolerance and truth deserves examination. Some critics argue that principled tolerance requires abandoning claims to truth. If you believe your views are true and others false, you cannot genuinely tolerate competing views. Tolerance becomes just strategic compromise rather than principled commitment. Voltaire rejected this position. He believed certain truths, particularly about empirical matters, could be established through evidence and reasoning. Tolerance applied to questions where competing views all exceed what evidence can demonstrate, not to all disagreements, regardless of evidential status. This distinction between tolerating different opinions on inherently uncertain questions versus tolerating factually false claims remains relevant. Consider contemporary debates about climate science, vaccine safety, or historical facts. Does tolerance require treating evidence-based conclusions and evidence-free assertions as equally valid? Voltaire would say no. Tolerance means respecting others' rights to hold views on metaphysical and theological questions that cannot be definitively resolved. It does not mean treating all factual claims as equally credible regardless of evidence. Separation of church and state formed a crucial component of Voltaire's vision for tolerance. When government and religious institutions unite, each strengthens the other's power while restricting liberty. The Church gains state enforcement for its doctrines. The state gains religious legitimation for its authority. This alliance produces persecution of religious dissenters and suppression of free inquiry. Separating these institutions removes government coercion from religious affairs and religious justification from government actions. Voltaire's advocacy for separation preceded the American constitutional settlement by several decades. Thomas Jefferson's famous wall of separation between church and state, built on foundations Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers established. The First Amendment's prohibition on establishment of religion and protection of free exercise implemented principles Voltaire had articulated. American founders read Voltaire extensively and absorbed his arguments about religious liberty. The practical success of American religious pluralism vindicated Voltaire's theoretical claims that separated institutions could coexist peacefully. However, separation poses practical challenges Voltaire did not fully address. Should government be completely neutral between religions, or should it actively promote secular values over religious ones? When religious convictions conflict with civil law, which takes precedence, how much religious expression should be permitted in public institutions? These questions generate ongoing controversy in modern pluralistic societies. Voltaire's principles provide starting points, but not complete answers. The Calas affair illustrates how Voltaire translated philosophical principles into practical activism. His investigation and advocacy campaign achieved remarkable success. He mobilized public opinion through published pamphlets detailing the injustice. He recruited influential supporters to pressure French authorities. He raised money to support the Calas family. After 3 years of effort, the verdict was overturned in 1765, and Jean Calas was posthumously exonerated. The Calas widow received financial compensation. This outcome demonstrated that philosophical arguments combined with strategic activism could challenge entrenched power and achieve practical justice. Voltaire engaged in similar campaigns for other victims of religious persecution. The Servan family, also Protestants, faced charges of murdering their daughter to prevent Catholic conversion. Pierre-Paul Servan fled France with his family before arrest. Voltaire provided them shelter and worked to clear their names. The Chevalier de la Barre was executed in 1766 for blasphemy, specifically for failing to remove his hat during a religious procession and allegedly possessing banned books, including Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary. Voltaire could not prevent this execution, but memorialized it as an example of religious fanaticism's continuing danger. These campaigns made tolerance more than abstract principle. Voltaire showed that intellectuals bear responsibility to defend victims of injustice, not merely theorize about justice in the abstract. This activist dimension of his work inspired later human rights movements. The 20th century campaigns by Amnesty International and other organizations to defend prisoners of conscience follow patterns Voltaire established. Individual cases of injustice become opportunities to challenge systematic oppression and vindicate universal principles. Economic dimensions of tolerance deserve attention. Voltaire connected religious tolerance to commercial prosperity. When different religious communities coexist peacefully, they engage in productive exchange that enriches society. When persecution forces minorities to flee, economic potential leaves with them. This argument appealed to rulers' self-interest in ways purely moral arguments might not. Even monarchs unmoved by justice claims might respond to demonstrations that tolerance produces wealth and power. Modern economics research on institutional quality supports Voltaire's intuition. Societies with stronger protection for individual rights, including religious liberty, tend to experience higher economic growth. Secure property rights, contract enforcement, and rule of law all correlate with prosperity. Religious tolerance indicates broader institutional quality that supports economic development. Intolerant societies waste resources on persecution, lose human capital through emigration, and discourage innovation by restricting free inquiry. The causal mechanisms Voltaire identified find confirmation in contemporary development economics. Tolerance's relationship to truth-seeking requires deeper analysis. Scientific and intellectual progress depend on free exchange of ideas. When authorities suppress heterodox views, they prevent error correction and slow knowledge advancement. The Catholic Church's persecution of Galileo exemplified this problem. Galileo's astronomical observations contradicted church doctrine about Earth's central position in the cosmos. Rather than revising doctrine to accommodate evidence, church authorities forced Galileo to recant and suppressed heliocentric theory. This episode demonstrated how intolerance obstructs truth. John Stuart Mill would later develop this argument systematically in On Liberty, published in 1859. Mill argued that even false opinions deserve protection because confronting them strengthens true beliefs and prevents truth from becoming dead dogma. Voltaire anticipated these insights without Mill's systematic development. His defense of free inquiry rested on recognition that authority often mistakes falsehood for truth and suppresses genuine advances in understanding. Only open competition between ideas allows truth to emerge and error to be corrected. The contemporary relevance of Voltaire's arguments about tolerance remains striking. Religious conflict continues producing violence from Northern Ireland to the Middle East to Southeast Asia. Debates about free speech on social media platforms replay 18th century controversies about censorship and expression. Questions about religious accommodation in pluralistic societies generate ongoing political controversy. Voltaire's epistemological skepticism, historical awareness, and practical wisdom offer resources for addressing these persistent challenges. We may not live in the 18th century, but we still struggle with problems Voltaire identified and solutions he proposed. Part 5. The Problem of Evil and Human Suffering. The problem of evil stands as one of philosophy's oldest and most challenging questions. If God is all good and all-powerful, why does evil exist? If God can prevent suffering but does not, he seems malevolent. If God wants to prevent suffering but cannot, he seems impotent. Traditional theodicy attempts to reconcile divine perfection with observable evil. Voltaire spent decades wrestling with this problem, and his views evolved dramatically through personal experience and historical catastrophe. Early in his career, Voltaire accepted a form of philosophical optimism influenced by Newton and Alexander Pope. Newton's natural philosophy revealed a cosmos governed by elegant mathematical laws. This cosmic order suggested a divine intelligence organizing nature according to rational principles. Pope's Essay on Man from 1733 argued that apparent evils serve purposes within the larger scheme that humans cannot fully comprehend. Everything fits into a divinely ordained system where each part contributes to overall perfection. Voltaire found this vision intellectually satisfying and wrote works like Zadig in 1747 that portrayed evil as leading ultimately to good. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz provided the most sophisticated version of philosophical optimism. In his Theodicy from 1710, Leibniz argued that God, being perfect, must have created the best of all possible worlds. This does not mean a world without any evil, but rather a world where the maximum amount of good coexists with the minimum necessary evil. Evil exists because eliminating it entirely would require reducing good even more. For example, human free will enables both virtue and vice. A world without free will would eliminate vice, but also eliminate genuine virtue, producing less good overall. Therefore, a world with free will, despite enabling evil, is better than one without it. Leibniz's argument involves comparing entire possible worlds, not isolated features. Maybe this particular evil seems unnecessary, but removing it would require changing other features of the world in ways that reduce total goodness. God optimizes across all variables simultaneously, creating the world with the highest ratio of good to evil. From our limited perspective, we cannot see how individual evils contribute to overall perfection. But rational analysis shows that an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God must have chosen this world as optimal. Voltaire initially found this reasoning persuasive, or at least compatible with his deism. But the Lisbon earthquake of November 1st, 1755, shattered his acceptance of optimism. The earthquake struck at 9:30 in the morning on All Saints' Day, when churches were crowded with worshippers. Buildings collapsed, killing tens of thousands instantly. Fire swept through the ruins. A tsunami followed, drowning survivors who had fled to the harbour. Between 30,000 and 60,000 people died in Lisbon alone. Destruction extended throughout Portugal, Spain, and North Africa. The catastrophe's scale and arbitrariness horrified Voltaire. Why would God destroy a city full of people attending religious services on a holy day? What possible greater good could justify such indiscriminate slaughter? If this was the best of all possible worlds, the phrase had no meaning. Voltaire wrote his poem on the Lisbon disaster in 1756 as an immediate response. The poem attacked philosophical optimism with bitter sarcasm, demanding to know how Leibniz would explain this catastrophe as necessary for overall perfection. In the poem, Voltaire confronted optimism's cruel implications. Telling victims that their suffering serves a higher purpose adds insult to injury. It transforms tragedy into metaphysical necessity, removing any basis for compassion or action to prevent future suffering. If everything is for the best, then working to improve conditions becomes pointless or even wrong. Optimism paralyzes moral action by declaring that apparent evil is secretly good. Voltaire found this position both intellectually false and morally repugnant. The poem also raised the problem of particular evil versus general arguments. Optimism might seem plausible when considering the world abstractly. Perhaps the overall system exhibits more good than evil in some cosmic accounting. But when you confront specific victims, the abstract justification collapses. What do you tell the mother whose child died crushed in church rubble? That this death was necessary for the best possible world? The statement reveals optimism's moral bankruptcy when applied to actual suffering. Voltaire developed these critiques fully in Candide, published in 1759. The novel follows the young Candide through a series of catastrophes that test his teacher Pangloss's optimistic philosophy. Pangloss insists throughout that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, no matter what horrors occur. Candide experiences war, earthquake, disease, betrayal, slavery, and countless other evils. Pangloss maintains his optimism even after being hanged, dissected, and enslaved. His commitment to Leibniz's philosophy becomes increasingly absurd as suffering accumulates. The novel's satirical power lies in juxtaposing Pangloss's abstract philosophy with vivid descriptions of concrete suffering. After the Lisbon earthquake, Pangloss philosophizes about sufficient reasons, while Candide begs for help, trapped under rubble. Pangloss explains that the earthquake must have occurred because underground sulfur deposits needed to explode. This mechanical explanation provides no comfort and ignores the human tragedy. Voltaire shows that optimistic philosophy serves as an excuse for inaction and indifference to suffering. If everything is already optimal, why help victims or prevent future disasters? Voltaire also satirized the distinction between moral evil caused by humans and natural evil caused by non-human forces. Optimists argued that moral evil results from human free will, not divine creation. Natural evil, like earthquakes, serves purposes in the larger system we cannot comprehend. But Candide demonstrates this distinction fails to resolve the problem. Why did God create a world where natural evil kills innocents indiscriminately? Why didn't omnipotence find a way to achieve whatever purposes earthquakes serve without killing thousands? The novel's supporting characters all have horrific backstories illustrating evil's ubiquity. Cunegonde was raped, enslaved, and disfigured. The old woman had her buttock cut off during a siege. Cacambo witnessed countless atrocities. Martin, the pessimistic philosopher, argues that evil dominates the world based on his observations. Only the naive Candide and the obstinate Pangloss maintain optimism in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. Through this accumulation of horrors, Voltaire suggests that honest observation contradicts Leibnizian metaphysics. Voltaire had Candide visit El Dorado, a utopian society where suffering is minimal and people live rationally without greed or religious conflict. This interlude serves multiple purposes. It shows Voltaire believed human society could be better organized to reduce suffering. It contrasts with the corruption and violence in European civilization. But significantly, Candide and Cacambo choose to leave El Dorado despite its perfection. They want to recover Cunegonde and pursue personal goals, even at the cost of forsaking paradise. This decision suggests that even in an ideal society, humans would face difficulties and make imperfect choices. The novel ends with one of literature's most analysed and debated passages. Pangloss tries one last time to defend optimism by arguing that all their sufferings were necessary to bring them to their current situation. Candide replies, "That is well said, but we must cultivate our garden." This concluding injunction has generated centuries of interpretation. Does cultivating the garden mean withdrawing from public life into private productivity? Does it advocate practical action over metaphysical speculation? Does it suggest focusing on what we can control rather than cosmic questions beyond our understanding? Multiple readings seem intentionally possible. Voltaire offers no replacement metaphysical system for the optimism he demolished. Instead, he redirects attention from ultimate questions about evil's place in the cosmic order to immediate questions about reducing suffering and increasing well-being. We cannot know why God permits evil or whether this is the best possible world, but we can work to make our small corner of the world better through practical effort. Cultivating the garden becomes a metaphor for pragmatic improvement, replacing abstract theodicy. The phrase also connects to agricultural improvement and economic productivity. Literally, cultivating gardens increases food supply and material welfare. By extension, applying reason and effort to practical problems generates progress without requiring resolution of metaphysical puzzles. Voltaire suggests that humans should focus energy on achievable improvements rather than insoluble questions about ultimate meaning and divine purposes. This pragmatic turn anticipates later utilitarian ethics that evaluate actions by their consequences for well-being. However, some critics argue this conclusion represents retreat rather than solution. If we cannot answer fundamental questions about evil's existence, how do we know our practical efforts actually reduce it? Maybe cultivating gardens accidentally increases suffering in ways we cannot see. Without metaphysical grounding, practical action seems arbitrary. Voltaire might respond that empirical observation shows some actions clearly reduce suffering while others increase it. We need not solve the problem of evil to recognize that medicine heals disease and violence causes pain. Practical knowledge suffices for improving human welfare. Voltaire's treatment of evil connects to his views on free will and determinism. In his earlier work, Treatise on Metaphysics from 1734, he wrestled with whether humans possess genuine freedom or whether our actions are determined by prior causes. Leibnizian optimism seemed to require determinism. If God chose this as the best possible world, everything must unfold according to divine plan. Human free will would introduce unpredictability that could make outcomes worse than God intended. But without free will, humans cannot be morally responsible for their actions. How can we blame criminals or praise heroes if they had no choice? Voltaire never resolved this tension satisfactorily. He recognized the philosophical difficulty while insisting on practical necessity of treating humans as responsible agents. Even if determinism is metaphysically true, we must act as if we have free will, because social order requires assigning responsibility. This pragmatic resolution frustrates philosophers seeking systematic consistency, but reflects Voltaire's general approach. When metaphysical questions prove insoluble, adopt whatever assumption makes practical life workable. The problem of evil raises questions about whether Voltaire remained a theist after rejecting optimism. If evil's existence contradicts divine perfection, perhaps no perfect God exists. Atheism would dissolve the problem by removing the expectation that the universe should exhibit moral order. Voltaire consistently rejected this solution. He maintained belief in God based on the design argument while abandoning the claim that God's purposes are good by human standards. Perhaps God created the universe according to necessities beyond our understanding that do not involve maximizing human welfare. This position resembles views in the Book of Job, where God responds to questions about suffering by asserting divine inscrutability. Humans cannot comprehend God's reasons, so expecting the world to match human conceptions of justice is presumptuous. Voltaire admired Job's challenge to easy theodicy. Unlike Job's comforters, who insist suffering must reflect deserved punishment, Job demands honest accounting for innocent suffering. God's response validates the question while refusing easy answers. Voltaire adopted a similar position. Acknowledge the reality of evil without pretending to explain it. Contemporary philosophers continue debating whether theism can accommodate evil's existence. The evidential problem of evil argues that suffering's quantity and distribution make God's existence unlikely, even if not logically impossible. The logical problem of evil argues that evil's existence logically contradicts divine perfection. Defenders develop sophisticated theodicies, attempting to show how evil might serve purposes justifying permission by a perfect deity. Voltaire's critique anticipated and rejected most standard theodicies. They sacrifice intellectual honesty by explaining away rather than confronting suffering's horror. Neuroscience and evolutionary biology offer perspectives on suffering that Voltaire could not have known, but that align with his views. Pain evolved as a signal that motivates avoiding damage and promoting healing. Suffering connects to brain mechanisms serving survival and reproduction, not cosmic justice or divine purposes. This naturalistic explanation demystifies evil as a side effect of physical processes rather than a metaphysical puzzle requiring solution. Voltaire's empirical approach to philosophical problems anticipated this naturalistic turn, even without modern scientific knowledge. The practical implications of Voltaire's critique of optimism remain relevant. Psychological research shows that just world belief, the assumption that people get what they deserve, correlates with reduced empathy for victims. If we think suffering must be deserved or serve higher purposes, we feel less motivated to help. Voltaire recognized this dynamic centuries before psychological studies confirmed it. Rejecting theodicy becomes morally necessary to maintain compassion and motivation for reducing suffering. We must see evil as genuinely evil, not secretly good, to commit to fighting it. Part 6. History, Progress, and Civilization. Voltaire revolutionized how Europeans understood and wrote history. Before him, history served primarily as moral instruction or religious chronicle. Historians focused on kings, battles, and divine providence guiding human affairs. Voltaire transformed history into analysis of culture, institutions, economics, and ideas. He asked new questions about why civilizations rise and fall, how customs develop, what factors promote human welfare. This approach laid foundations for modern social history and historical sociology. His historical methodology reflected his empiricist philosophy. History should be based on documentary evidence, not legend or religious tradition. Voltaire criticized earlier historians for accepting miraculous events without skeptical examination. He demanded the same evidential standards for historical claims as for scientific propositions. If you cannot verify an event through multiple independent sources, treat it skeptically. This critical approach offended religious authorities who insisted biblical history was literally true, regardless of evidence. The Age of Louis XIV, published in 1751, exemplified Voltaire's innovative method. Rather than merely chronicling military campaigns and political intrigues, Voltaire analysed French culture during Louis's reign. He examined literature, arts, sciences, commerce, and social customs alongside political events. The book argued that Louis's era represented cultural achievement worthy of historical attention, independent of military glory. A civilization's greatness should be measured by its contributions to human knowledge and welfare, not conquest. This cultural focus marked a radical departure from traditional historical writing. Previous historians concentrated on rulers and political institutions as if they constituted history's entire content. Voltaire insisted that understanding an era required examining how ordinary people lived, what they believed, how they organized economic and social life. He pioneered social history decades before it became an established academic field. His approach influenced later historians from Jacob Burckhardt to Fernand Braudel, who studied culture and society rather than just politics. Essay on the Manners and Spirit of Nations, published in 1756, pursued even more ambitious goals. Voltaire attempted a universal history examining civilizations across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. He rejected the Eurocentric assumption that European history was world history. Chinese civilization, he noted, predated Christianity by millennia and achieved sophisticated culture, technology, and governance. Islamic societies preserved Greek learning during Europe's Dark Ages and made original contributions to mathematics and science. American civilizations developed complex social organization despite isolation from Old World influences. This global perspective challenged providential history that interpreted events as divine plan, culminating in Christian Europe. Bossuet's Discourse on Universal History from 1681 represented this tradition. Bossuet portrayed history as God preparing humanity for Christianity's revelation. Everything before Christianity was mere prelude, and everything after demonstrated Christian civilization's superiority. Voltaire demolished this framework by showing that multiple civilizations achieved greatness independently of Christianity and often declined after adopting it. Voltaire's attitude toward progress was complex and changed over time. Early in his career, he believed human societies advance through application of reason to practical problems. Scientific knowledge accumulates across generations, each building on previous discoveries. Legal and political institutions can be improved through rational reform. Cultural sophistication increases as barbarism gives way to civilization. This optimistic progressivism characterized much Enlightenment thought and inspired reform movements throughout Europe. However, Voltaire never embraced naive linear progress narratives. History showed civilizations rising and falling in cycles rather than steadily advancing. Rome had achieved remarkable culture and governance, then collapsed into feudal disorder. The Renaissance recovered classical learning after centuries of medieval stagnation. No guarantee existed that progress would continue or that societies could not regress into barbarism. Human irrationality, superstition, and violence constantly threaten Enlightenment's fragile achievements. The concept of progress itself requires careful examination. What counts as progress, and who decides? Voltaire measured progress primarily through reduction of superstition, increase in tolerance, and growth of prosperity. Societies advance when they replace religious dogma with rational inquiry, persecution with tolerance, poverty with commerce. But this definition reflects Enlightenment values that not all cultures share. Is Western European civilization in 1750 actually more advanced than Chinese civilization with its ancient traditions and different values? Voltaire struggled with this tension between universal standards and cultural diversity. He wanted to judge civilizations by objective criteria like prosperity, justice, and knowledge advancement. Yet he recognized that different societies organized themselves successfully according to different principles. Chinese governance differed fundamentally from European models, but produced a stable, prosperous society for millennia. This relativistic insight undermined simple progress narratives, where all societies should converge on European patterns. His treatment of non-European civilizations exhibited both admiration and prejudice. Voltaire praised Chinese philosophy, legal codes, and administrative efficiency. He admired Islamic contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and preservation of classical texts. He found much to respect in various Asian and Middle Eastern cultures. However, he also reproduced European stereotypes and displayed cultural condescension. His descriptions of Africa particularly reflected ignorance and prejudice common to his era. He considered some societies irredeemably barbaric and incapable of civilization without European intervention. The economic dimension of Voltaire's historical thinking deserves attention. He believed commercial activity drives cultural development and social progress. Trade brings different societies into contact, promoting exchange of ideas alongside exchange of goods. Prosperous commercial societies develop arts, sciences, and refined culture that subsistence agricultural societies cannot support. Merchants and manufacturers create wealth through productive enterprise, unlike aristocrats who merely consume inherited privilege. Therefore, history's direction should be toward expanding commerce and reducing obstacles to economic exchange. This proto-capitalist historical vision influenced Adam Smith and classical political economy. Smith's Wealth of Nations from 1776 analyzed how commercial societies generate prosperity through specialization and exchange. Smith acknowledged debts to Voltaire and other French Enlightenment thinkers. The view that commerce civilizes and peace promotes prosperity became foundational to liberal economic thought. Voltaire helped establish the intellectual framework connecting economic freedom to cultural progress. However, this framework had severe limitations and blind spots. Voltaire largely ignored exploitation underlying commercial prosperity. European wealth increasingly derived from colonial extraction and slave labour during the 18th century. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations in the Americas relied on African slavery. Colonial trade enriched European merchants while impoverishing colonized peoples. Voltaire occasionally criticized slavery but failed to recognize how thoroughly commercial prosperity depended on violent exploitation. His celebration of commerce as civilizing force obscured the violence sustaining it. Voltaire's historical work influenced how Europeans understood civilization itself. Rather than viewing civilization as a fixed state some societies possess and others lack, he showed it as a process of development with multiple dimensions. Societies could be advanced in some areas while backward in others. Ancient Greece achieved philosophical and artistic brilliance but practiced slavery and excluded women from citizenship. Medieval Europe developed Gothic architecture and scholastic philosophy, but burned heretics and persecuted Jews. No civilization was purely civilized or purely barbaric. All mixed progress and regression. This nuanced view challenged both cultural chauvinism and cultural romanticism. European civilization could not claim unqualified superiority over all others, but neither could non-European cultures be idealized as innocent alternatives to European corruption. All societies exhibit strengths and weaknesses when examined honestly. Progress means building on strengths while correcting weaknesses, not fantasizing about perfect civilizations, past or present. The role of great individuals in history occupied Voltaire's attention. His biographical approach to the age of Louis XIV emphasized how Louis's decisions shaped French culture and politics. He wrote lives of Charles XIV of Sweden and Peter the Great of Russia. These works suggested that exceptional individuals drive historical change through their choices and characters. Yet Voltaire also recognized broader forces like economic development, technological change, and cultural movements that constrain individual action. The tension between great man theory and structural explanation remained unresolved. Modern historiography has moved largely beyond Voltaire's biographical focus towards structural analysis. Historians now emphasize long-term trends in climate, disease, technology, and economic organization. Individual leaders matter less than underlying material and social forces. However, recent work has recovered attention to contingency and individual agency within structural constraints. Voltaire's recognition that both individual choice and structural forces shape history seems more sophisticated than either extreme alone. Voltaire's use of history for political argument raises methodological questions. He selected evidence supporting his positions while ignoring contrary data. His treatment of religious history particularly exhibited tendentious interpretation designed to discredit Christianity. He exaggerated religious violence while minimizing secular violence. Critics accused him of propagandizing rather than honestly investigating the past. This criticism had merit. Voltaire's histories served polemical purposes alongside scholarly ones. He never pretended to write with academic detachment. Yet all history involves interpretation shaped by the historian's values and concerns. The pretense of pure objectivity often masks unstated assumptions and biases. Voltaire's explicit advocacy may be more honest than claims to neutrality that hide perspective. His work demonstrated that history necessarily involves judgment about what matters and how to evaluate past societies. Acknowledging this interpretive dimension makes historical claims more transparent and open to challenge. The question of historical inevitability versus contingency threads through Voltaire's work. Sometimes he wrote as if certain developments were necessary results of underlying causes. Commercial growth necessarily produces cultural refinement. Superstition necessarily gives way to reason as knowledge advances. Other times he emphasized contingency and accident in determining outcomes. If Louis XIV had made different choices, French history would have unfolded differently. This tension reflects genuine difficulty in determining how much historical development follows necessary patterns versus depending on chance. Contemporary historians recognize both necessity and contingency operate at different scales. Long-term material trends like agricultural productivity or technological capacity constrain possibilities in ways individuals cannot overcome. But within those constraints, specific outcomes depend on choices and accidents. The Industrial Revolution required certain preconditions, like coal deposits and legal institutions protecting property. But when and where it occurred depended on particular innovations and entrepreneurial decisions. Voltaire's alternation between deterministic and contingent explanation captures this complex reality. The legacy of Voltaire's historical work extends far beyond professional historiography. He showed that understanding society requires studying culture, ideas, economics, and everyday life alongside political events. He demonstrated that history could serve critical analysis of present institutions by revealing their contingent rather than necessary character. He proved that historical writing could reach broad audiences through literary craft and engaging narrative. These contributions made history intellectually respectable and socially relevant in ways that influence education and public discourse. Part 7. Influence, Legacy and Impact on Later Thinkers. Voltaire died in Paris on May 30th, 1778, at age 83. By then, his ideas had spread throughout Europe and across the Atlantic. His writings circulated in multiple languages despite censorship and bans. Intellectuals from St. Petersburg to Philadelphia read Voltaire and absorbed his arguments about reason, tolerance, and freedom. The decades following his death saw revolutionary transformations in Western politics that drew heavily on Enlightenment thought he helped shape. The American Revolution occurred during Voltaire's lifetime, though he died before American independence was secured. The Declaration of Independence's assertion of self, evident truths, and unalienable rights echoed Enlightenment principles Voltaire championed. Thomas Jefferson owned many of Voltaire's works and read him throughout his life. Benjamin Franklin met Voltaire in Paris in 1778, shortly before Voltaire's death. Franklin brought his grandson to receive Voltaire's blessing, and Voltaire blessed the boy with the words, "God and liberty." This meeting symbolized the connection between French Enlightenment thought and American revolutionary ideals. Jefferson's commitment to religious freedom and separation of church and state derived partly from Voltaire's arguments. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, that Jefferson drafted in 1777 embodied Voltairean principles. No one should be compelled to support religious institutions through taxation. Religious belief should be entirely voluntary and protected from government interference. These ideas, revolutionary in their time, became foundational to American constitutional order. The First Amendment's religion clauses implemented separation that Voltaire had advocated decades earlier. James Madison, primary architect of the Constitution, also drew on Enlightenment thinkers, including Voltaire. Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments from 1785 argued for complete separation using arguments that paralleled Voltaire's writings. Religious truth cannot be established by majority vote or government decree. History shows that government involvement in religion corrupts both institutions. Therefore, strict separation protects both religious liberty and political legitimacy. These Voltairean principles became embedded in American political institutions. However, the American founders differed from Voltaire in crucial respects. They created democratic institutions that Voltaire had distrusted. They established constitutional limits on government power through separation of powers and federalism. They relied on Montesquieu's institutional analysis more than Voltaire's faith in enlightened rulers. The American experiment demonstrated that stable democracy was possible, contrary to Voltaire's skepticism. Yet the fundamental values, individual liberty, religious tolerance, government accountability, derived substantially from Enlightenment, thought Voltaire had articulated. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, 11 years after Voltaire's death. Revolutionaries invoked Voltaire's name and celebrated him as a prophet of liberation from tyranny. In 1791, the revolutionary government transferred Voltaire's remains to the Pantheon in Paris with elaborate ceremony. The procession banner declared, "He taught us to be free." Revolutionary pamphlets and speeches quoted Voltaire's attacks on church and monarchy to justify radical transformation. Yet Voltaire would likely have been horrified by the revolution's violence and radicalism. The terror of 1793 through 94 saw thousands executed by guillotine, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Revolutionary tribunals condemned aristocrats, clergy, and political opponents to death with minimal legal process. The attempt to dechristianize France included closing churches, persecuting priests, and promoting a cult of reason. This exceeded anything Voltaire advocated. He wanted reform, not revolutionary destruction of existing order. Conservative critics blamed Enlightenment philosophy for revolutionary violence. If thinkers like Voltaire taught people to question all authority and tradition, chaos and bloodshed naturally followed. Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, from 1790, argued this position. Burke claimed that abstract reason divorced from tradition and experience produces destructive fanaticism. The terror demonstrated what happens when philosophical principles override practical wisdom and inherited institutions. Voltaire's legacy became contested between those who claimed his mantle for liberation and those who blamed his ideas for disaster. This debate oversimplifies both Voltaire's actual views and the revolution's complex causes. Voltaire consistently opposed violent revolution and supported gradual reform through enlightened monarchy. He valued order and stability alongside liberty. He never advocated overthrowing government or executing rulers. The revolution stemmed from multiple factors, including fiscal crisis, crop failures, international war, and political radicalization under emergency conditions. Blaming Enlightenment philosophy for these developments ignores economic and political causes while exaggerating ideas' causal power. Nevertheless, the association between Voltaire and revolution shaped his 19th century reputation. Conservatives viewed him as a dangerous subversive whose corrosive skepticism undermined social order. Liberals and radicals claimed him as a champion of progress and freedom. Both sides recognized his enormous influence while interpreting it differently. This political polarization around Voltaire's legacy continues influencing how different ideological groups appropriate or reject his ideas. Immanuel Kant explicitly acknowledged Voltaire's influence on his own thought. Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment?, from 1784, defined enlightenment as humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity through use of reason. This definition captured Voltaire's central message. Think for yourself, question authority, rely on evidence and reasoning rather than tradition. Kant praised the freedom to publicly discuss and criticize that Voltaire had championed throughout his life. Though Kant developed systematic philosophy Voltaire never attempted, the critical spirit came directly from Voltaire's example. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty from 1859 extended Voltairean arguments about freedom of expression. Mill argued that silencing opinion, even false opinion, harms humanity by preventing error correction and making truth into dead dogma. These arguments elaborated points Voltaire had made without systematic development. Mill acknowledged debts to Enlightenment thinkers who established liberal principles he sought to defend. Voltaire's practical advocacy for tolerance and free inquiry provided foundations for Mill's theoretical justifications. 19th-century liberal movements across Europe invoked Voltaire's legacy. Campaigns for secular education, separation of church and state, freedom of press and religious tolerance all claimed inspiration from his work. Liberal parties and newspapers adopted his rhetoric and arguments. The gradual secularization of European societies during the 19th and 20th centuries implemented programs Voltaire had outlined. Religious authority declined, legal systems became rationalized, censorship diminished, religious minorities gained civil rights. These developments realized many of Voltaire's goals, even if not always through means he would have endorsed. Voltaire's influence extended beyond politics to literature and culture. His satirical style influenced countless later writers from Jonathan Swift to Mark Twain. The use of humor and irony to convey serious criticism became a standard literary technique. Candide remains constantly in print and continues generating scholarly interpretation 3 centuries after publication. Its combination of entertainment and philosophy demonstrates that literature can convey ideas as effectively as systematic treatises. The development of human rights discourse owes significant debt to Voltaire's activism. His campaigns on behalf of Jean Calas and other persecution victims established patterns for later advocacy. Individual cases of injustice become opportunities to challenge systematic oppression and vindicate universal principles. Organizations like Amnesty International follow methods Voltaire pioneered, investigate specific abuses, publicize them to mobilize opinion, pressure authorities to provide remedy. The concept that intellectuals bear responsibility to defend victims of injustice derives partly from Voltaire's example. Modern secular humanism draws heavily on Voltairean foundations. The view that human welfare, rather than divine command, should guide ethics and politics reflects his pragmatic approach. The emphasis on reason, evidence, and critical thinking as paths to knowledge echoes his epistemology. The commitment to tolerance and pluralism in matters of conscience follows his arguments. Humanist organizations explicitly claim Voltaire as a predecessor and cite his writings in defense of secular values. Whether or not contemporary humanists interpret Voltaire accurately, his symbolic importance for secular movements remains enormous. However, some modern thinkers criticize aspects of Voltaire's legacy. Post-colonial scholars note his Eurocentrism and failure to adequately criticize colonialism and slavery. Feminist critics point out his acceptance of gender hierarchy and exclusion of women from full citizenship. Democratic theorists reject his elitism and distrust of popular participation. These criticisms remind us that Enlightenment thinkers, including Voltaire, remained products of their time with limited perspectives. Appropriating their valuable insights requires critical engagement, not uncritical veneration. The question of whether Voltaire's influence was beneficial or harmful for Western civilization admits no simple answer. His ideas contributed to liberalization, secularization, and expansion of individual rights that most modern people value. But the Enlightenment project also involved cultural arrogance, colonial domination, and naive faith in reason's power that produced harm. Evaluating Voltaire's net impact requires weighing complex consequences across multiple dimensions over several centuries. Different evaluators with different values and priorities reach different conclusions. Contemporary debates about free speech, religious accommodation, and secular values replay 18th-century controversies Voltaire engaged. Should social media platforms permit offensive speech or enforce community standards? Should religious objections to secular laws receive exemptions or accommodations? How should pluralistic democracies balance competing values and worldviews? Voltaire's arguments remain relevant because the underlying tensions persist. His solutions, epistemological humility combined with vigorous advocacy for tolerance, still offer valuable guidance even when specific applications require updating. The scientific revolution Voltaire helped publicize continues transforming human understanding and capabilities. Newtonian physics led to relativity and quantum mechanics. Empirical methodology enabled medical advances, saving millions of lives. The critical spirit Voltaire championed underpins ongoing scientific progress. However, technology's destructive potential also became evident through world wars, nuclear weapons, and environmental damage. Voltaire's optimism about science and reason improving human welfare requires qualification by recognition of how knowledge can be misused. Voltaire's enduring significance lies not in specific doctrines, but in his method and spirit. He demonstrated that authority and tradition deserve constant questioning. He showed that compassion for victims should motivate practical action, not just philosophical speculation. He proved that humour and wit can expose absurdity as effectively as logical argument. These contributions transcend particular political or religious positions. They embody an approach to intellectual and moral life that remains valuable regardless of changing circumstances. Voltaire's legacy is not a fixed set of beliefs, but an ongoing commitment to reason, tolerance, and human welfare. Part 8. Limitations, Contradictions, and Contemporary Relevance. Any honest assessment of Voltaire must confront his limitations and contradictions alongside his achievements. No thinker, however brilliant, transcends their historical moment completely. Voltaire exhibited blind spots, biases, and errors that diminish his legacy even while his contributions remain substantial. Understanding these limitations clarifies both what we can learn from Voltaire and where we must go beyond him. The most obvious limitation involves Voltaire's social and political elitism. Despite championing individual liberty, he consistently distrusted common people's judgment and capacity. He referred to the masses as rabble, who needed management by enlightened superiors. Democracy seemed dangerous because it empowered the ignorant majority over the educated minority. This aristocratic prejudice contradicted his commitment to human dignity and equality before natural law. If reason provides the basis for moral and political principles, why assume common people cannot use reason adequately? Voltaire would respond that education and leisure are prerequisites for rational deliberation about complex matters. Peasants working dawn to dusk lack opportunity to study philosophy, science, and politics. Without education, they remain vulnerable to demagogues and superstition. This argument contains truth. Political competence requires knowledge and analytical skills not everyone possesses equally. But Voltaire failed to recognize that excluding people from political participation perpetuates the conditions preventing their development. If education is necessary for citizenship, then universal education becomes imperative for democratic legitimacy. His elitism extended to economic matters. While criticizing aristocratic privilege, Voltaire himself invested in commerce and became wealthy. He displayed concern for prosperity, but little for how wealth was distributed or acquired. He occasionally criticized slavery, but did not campaign against it with anything approaching his energy on religious persecution. He profited from investments in companies engaged in colonial trade that exploited conquered peoples. His economic liberalism emphasized growth and freedom for property owners without adequate attention to exploitation and inequality. Voltaire's treatment of women reflected conventional 18th-century patriarchy. He had intellectual relationships with remarkable women like Émilie du Châtelet, who was a brilliant mathematician and physicist. He recognized women's intellectual capabilities when directly confronted with individual examples. Yet he never questioned systematic exclusion of women from education, property rights, and political participation. His writings often portrayed women as either virtuous but passive, or beautiful but frivolous. The universal principles he articulated somehow failed to extend to half of humanity. This failure reveals limits of Enlightenment universalism more broadly. Philosophers proclaimed universal human rights, but defined humanity in practice as educated European men. Women, colonized peoples, and lower classes were excluded from full moral and political standing. This contradiction between universal principle and particular application haunted Enlightenment thought. Later movements for women's suffrage, workers' rights, and decolonization extended Enlightenment principles beyond the boundaries their original advocates maintained. Voltaire helped establish the principles even while failing to recognize their full implications. His treatment of non-European cultures exhibited both cosmopolitanism and prejudice. He praised Chinese civilization to embarrass European Christian assumptions of superiority. He used examples from various cultures to demonstrate religious and moral diversity. Yet he also reinforced stereotypes and displayed Eurocentric condescension. His descriptions of African societies were particularly dismissive and ignorant. He considered some peoples irredeemably savage and incapable of civilization without European tutelage. This combination of cultural relativism and European supremacy pervaded Enlightenment thought generally. Voltaire's historical works demonstrated tendentious selection of evidence supporting predetermined conclusions. His treatment of Christianity exaggerated religious violence while minimizing secular violence. He portrayed the Middle Ages as uniformly dark and oppressive, ignoring genuine cultural and intellectual achievements. His accounts of religious controversies caricatured theological positions he found absurd rather than engaging their strongest forms. These methodological flaws undermined his credibility as a historian even while his broader interpretive insights remained valuable. The contradiction between his advocacy for tolerance and his personal intolerance troubled even his contemporaries. Voltaire engaged in vicious literary feuds with rivals, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He used his influence to damage opponents' reputations and careers. He sometimes called for censoring views he found dangerous, despite championing free expression generally. This inconsistency reveals that principled tolerance is difficult to maintain in practice. Even someone who theoretically defended others' right to disagree found disagreement threatening when it affected him personally. His relationship with enlightened despots demonstrated naivete about power's corrupting effects. Voltaire believed philosophical education would make rulers govern justly and rationally. Experience with Frederick the Great and Catherine should have taught him otherwise. Both rulers abandoned Enlightenment principles when politically convenient, despite their philosophical interests. Voltaire never adequately addressed why concentrated power would not corrupt even educated, well-intentioned rulers. His failure to embrace institutional checks on authority left his political philosophy incomplete and impractical. The relationship between Voltaire's deism and his attacks on religion raises questions about coherence. He maintained belief in God while ridiculing virtually all religious doctrines and practices. But if organized religion is as irrational and harmful as he claimed, what basis remains for believing in God at all? His design argument for God's existence faced logical difficulties he never adequately answered. His utilitarian defense of religious belief as necessary for social order contradicted his commitment to truth over utility. Some scholars argue Voltaire remained trapped in theistic assumptions he had intellectually outgrown. Recent scholarship has revealed complexities in Voltaire's religious thought, suggesting movement from deism toward more radical positions. His late writings show sympathy for ideas resembling Spinozistic pantheism, where God equals nature rather than existing separately as creator. If this interpretation is correct, Voltaire was more philosophically consistent than traditionally assumed, However, he never publicly abandoned deism, making it difficult to determine his final position. This ambiguity may reflect genuine uncertainty or strategic caution about expressing dangerous views. Voltaire's optimism about reason and progress seems naive from contemporary perspective. He believed that exposing superstition through rational argument would steadily reduce its influence. He expected commercial prosperity to civilize societies and reduce conflict. He thought educated leaders would implement reforms benefiting human welfare. These expectations were repeatedly disappointed. Religious conflict persists despite centuries of rationalist critique. Economic development produces new forms of exploitation alongside prosperity. Educated leaders prove as capable of tyranny as ignorant ones. 20th century horrors particularly challenged Enlightenment faith in progress. World wars killed millions using technology produced by scientific advancement. The Holocaust revealed that sophisticated European civilization could descend into industrialized genocide. Totalitarian regimes claimed to implement rational planning while perpetrating mass murder. These events suggested that reason and science could serve evil as effectively as good. Some critics concluded that Enlightenment rationalism itself enabled modern atrocities by eroding traditional moral restraints without providing adequate replacements. However, this critique oversimplifies both Enlightenment thought and 20th century catastrophes. Voltaire never claimed that reason alone suffices for moral conduct. He emphasized moral sentiments like compassion alongside rational analysis. He warned against fanaticism, whether religious or secular. Nazi ideology explicitly rejected Enlightenment universalism in favor of racial particularism and irrationalism. Soviet totalitarianism distorted Marx's thought through Leninist vanguardism that Voltaire would have recognized as dangerous. Blaming Enlightenment rationalism for fascism and communism requires ignoring how both movements rejected core Enlightenment values. Contemporary debates about Enlightenment legacy continue dividing scholars and public intellectuals. Defenders argue that Enlightenment principles of reason, individual rights, and scientific inquiry remain essential for human progress and should be defended against both reactionary and postmodern critics. Critics contend that Enlightenment universalism masked particular Western interests and enabled colonialism, environmental destruction, and cultural homogenization. Both positions contain partial truth requiring synthesis rather than simple acceptance or rejection. We need Enlightenment's critical spirit while recognizing its historical limitations and unfinished business. Voltaire's relevance to contemporary issues appears most clearly in ongoing conflicts over religion and secularism. Should secular states accommodate religious practices that conflict with general laws? How much religious expression belongs in public spaces like schools and government buildings? Can liberal democracies tolerate religious communities that reject liberal values internally? Voltaire's epistemological argument for tolerance provides useful guidance. No one knows ultimate religious truth with certainty, so humility demands respecting diverse convictions. But applying this principle to specific cases generates controversy that Voltaire's abstract formulations cannot resolve. Free speech debates in the digital age replay Enlightenment controversies about expression and censorship. Social media platforms must decide what content to permit and what to ban. governments struggle to balance free expression against dangers from misinformation, hate speech, and incitement. These dilemmas would have been familiar to Voltaire, even though specific technologies differ. His arguments for protecting controversial speech remain relevant even as new circumstances require new applications. The underlying tension between liberty and order that concerned him persists in altered forms. The scientific method Voltaire championed faces new challenges from science denial and pseudoscience. Climate change denial, vaccine hesitancy, and conspiracy theories spread despite scientific consensus. The problem is not lack of evidence, but motivated reasoning and tribal identity influencing belief formation. Voltaire assumed that rational argument would overcome superstition once evidence became clear. Cognitive science shows that humans defend existing beliefs through biased interpretation of evidence regardless of rational arguments. This suggests limits to Enlightenment rationalism that require psychological understanding beyond philosophical argument. However, Voltaire's approach remains valuable despite these complications. Persistent advocacy for evidence-based reasoning eventually shifts opinion even when individual minds resist change. Institutional commitment to scientific method enables technological progress despite popular misconceptions. Education in critical thinking improves people's ability to evaluate claims even if it does not eliminate bias. The solution is not abandoning Enlightenment rationalism, but understanding its psychological and social preconditions more deeply than Voltaire could. Questions about human nature that Voltaire engaged remain central to philosophy and science. Are humans primarily rational or primarily emotional creatures? How much does culture versus biology determine behavior? Can moral progress occur, or does human nature impose fixed limits? Voltaire's empirical approach to these questions, observing actual human behavior rather than deducing from first principles, anticipated scientific psychology. Modern research confirms some of his insights while contradicting others, enabling refinement of Enlightenment psychology through empirical investigation. The environmental crisis poses challenges that Enlightenment thought did not anticipate. Voltaire celebrated commerce and economic growth as civilizing forces producing prosperity. He never considered that unlimited growth might deplete resources or degrade environments beyond recovery. The assumption that human flourishing requires dominating nature now appears dangerously mistaken. Some environmentalists blame Enlightenment anthropocentrism for ecological destruction. Others argue that Enlightenment science and rationality provide tools for addressing environmental problems. Both perspectives contain truth requiring balanced assessment of what to preserve and what to revise in Enlightenment legacy. Voltaire's legacy remains contested precisely because it matters. If his ideas were merely historical curiosities, we could study them with detachment. But his arguments about tolerance, freedom, reason and progress continue shaping how we understand ourselves and organize society. Different political and ideological movements appropriate Voltaire for conflicting purposes. Secular humanists claim him against religious conservatives. Classical liberals invoke him against both traditionalists and socialists. Each group emphasizes aspects of his thought supporting their agenda while ignoring contradictory elements. Recovering Voltaire's actual views requires reading his works carefully in historical context. He was neither the pure rationalist champion of liberty that admirers portray, nor the destructive skeptic undermining civilization that critics denounce. He was a complex, contradictory thinker whose brilliant insights coexisted with significant blind spots. His value lies not in providing final answers to perennial questions, but in demonstrating how to engage them honestly. Question authority, demand evidence, defend the oppressed, mock the pretentious, remain humble about what you cannot know. These habits of mind remain Voltaire's most valuable legacy. The deepest lesson from studying Voltaire may involve recognizing limits of individual genius. No single person can transcend their historical moment completely or solve all intellectual problems. Every thinker's contributions exist alongside limitations, reflecting their particular circumstances and perspectives. Progress occurs not through discovering perfect philosophical systems, but through cumulative refinement across generations. We build on insights from Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers while correcting their errors and addressing issues they could not have anticipated. This process of critical appropriation, taking what is valuable while rejecting what is harmful, characterizes intellectual and moral development. Voltaire's contemporary relevance ultimately depends on whether his fundamental commitments remain defensible. Should we still believe that reason provides reliable guidance for understanding nature and organizing society? Should we maintain that tolerance and freedom represent fundamental values worth defending? Should we work toward reducing human suffering through practical effort rather than accepting it as metaphysically necessary? Most people in liberal democratic societies answer yes to these questions, though interpretations vary. Voltaire helped establish these commitments as foundational to modern civilization, even while leaving much work for later generations. His legacy is not a finished project, but an ongoing invitation to think critically, act compassionately, and never stop questioning.